And my position changed. And one of the things that bugs me about politics today is that people's positions don't change, that they stay frozen in their thinking. And I've developed the attitude, it's not where you start, it's where you finish. And so the process of developing the open internet rule was an evolutionary process of trying to think about how is the best way to protect what is the most important network of the 21st century.
I am delighted to welcome here today Tom Wheeler. Tom has been with us all academic year as the Walter Shorenstein Media and Democracy Fellow, and it has been one of the great honors of my tenure thus far to get to know Tom and to work with him. He previously served as chairman of the Federal Communications Commission from 2013 to 2017 under President Obama. For more than 30 years, Tom Wheeler has been involved with new telecommunications networks and services, experiencing the revolution in telecommunications as a policy expert, as an advocate, and as a businessman. As an entrepreneur, he started or helped start multiple companies offering cable, wireless, and video communication services. I think it's fair to say that the incredibly connected world we live in exists in part due to Tom's work in the private sector and in part due to Tom's work in the public sector. Welcome, Tom, and thank you so much for your public service.
Well, thank you, Nico. It's great to be here, and I would second the reaction about what a privilege it has been to be here at the Shorenstein Center. First last semester, and then this semester, and work with you. And I also ought to note that sitting in the audience is Martha Minow, who just retired as the dean of the law school. And I was also fortunate enough last semester, thanks to Martha's leadership, to be able to teach a course over at the law school on public policy decision making. So it's great to be here.
So I want to ask you first about, I guess, the world we live in. When you first became the FCC chairman in 2013, that was only 5 years ago, but feels like an eternity in some sense. And
it feels like an eternity to you. Living through that seemed like an eternity.
And we've had such rapid changes in our information environment, in technology, and in adoption of different kinds of technologies. What has surprised you most in terms of what's happened since 2013?
Well, I don't know it's what surprised me most, Nico, but what's really interesting, and it was a privilege to be able to be in a policy-making role in the midst of the kind of change that technology is driving on us. And there's two things that are happening simultaneously. One is that digital technology is redefining both commerce and culture. And two, that it is coming at us faster than we ever saw any other technology evolve. So for instance, it was 45 years after Alexander Graham Bell's discovery here in Boston of the telephone that the telephone finally got into 25% of American households. Wow. It was 7 years for the smartphone to reach that kind of. We're living in a period of time where the buffer that adoption used to allow us to acclimate to the kinds of changes driven by new technology is disappearing. And in that kind of a truncated buffer period, the kind of work that happens here at HKS and the Shorenstein Center, the kind of work that that deals with, tries to anticipate the effects of these changes, become all the more important.
What, the title of this talk was meant to be the FCC and net neutrality, in part because we're in the middle of some, I think, a really significant rollback of some of your accomplishments as FCC chairman. And before we get into the current moment on net neutrality, I wondered if you could just give us a little bit of background about what that was like living through that as FCC chairman. I think it would be fair to say that when you were appointed, everybody knew that was going to be one of the defining issues in front of the commission. And your background in the cable industry, I think, led to some real suspicion about your ability to deal with that even-handed. And you were, in many ways, I think, a surprise hero to many casual observers of the net neutrality issue.
Well, I was on the job 3 months, I think, when the D.C. Circuit handed down the decision in the Verizon case in which they overturned my predecessor, Julius Janikowski's decision on his approach to an open internet. And that started a whole process that truly was probably the most interesting year of my life. And one of the things that I had specified when I became chairman is that we would no longer consider rulemakings on the basis of the way things had been done before, which was kind of we think that we ought to have a rulemaking on thus and so, tell us what you think. And I felt that it was important to put out a straw man, a proposal that had a rebuttable presumption in it, saying, here are specific ideas. We're not talking about generalities. Here's some specifics, have at them. And the first real effort at that, or the first high-profile effort at that, was the Open Internet rule, in which I made a proposal that followed the what I thought was the mandate of the court, the instruction of the court, and also then said, which was not Title II, which was not common carriage, and but I thought would get to the same ends. And then also said, but let's also discuss Title II, common carriage. And it became very clear to me during the course of the following half dozen months that I was glad we had this kind of specificity in the process, because it really focused in on that key issue of should it be common carriage or not. And two, I learned in this process greatly, and my position changed. And one of the things that bugs me about politics today is that people's positions don't change, that they stay frozen in their thinking. And I've developed the attitude, it's not where you start, it's where you finish. And so the process of developing the open internet rule was an evolutionary process of trying to think about how is the best way to protect what is the most important network of the 21st century. And I finally came to the conclusion that that needed to be, that those who provide internet service were common carriers.
And do you, we're looking at right now a real rollback of that from the current FCC chairman. And I also, it seems like there's a fair bit of real concern on the part of how this might impact consumers. And I wonder if you could kind of give, I would almost say in some cases hysteria, except maybe it's real. And so I wondered what your view was on if the current court challenges to the change in policy don't lead to some change. What's your view of the potential impact of the rollback of net neutrality?
Well, it's worse than you describe.
Okay.
It's not just that the Trump FCC has rolled back our open internet rules. It's the fact that they went one step beyond that and said, this agency will have nothing to do with the continuing oversight of the most important network of the 21st century. It's bad enough that they reversed our rules. It's breathtaking, bordering on outrageous, that they then went the next step and said, we'll wash our hands and everything having to do with the internet now will be handled by the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, which A, does not have regulatory authority, doesn't have rulemaking authority, has adjudicatory authority, but not rulemaking authority to say this is how things will be done. B, has no network expertise. And C, has to worry about every other aspect of the economy from pharmaceuticals to bleach labeling. And the interesting thing is that this is exactly what the ISPs, the internet service providers, the cable companies, the telephone companies set out to accomplish. It was fascinating. While I was waiting for confirmation, the Washington Post ran a story that was headlined, "Here's how the carriers intend to defang their regulator." And it went on to talk about recent public statements, particularly by the head of policy for AT&T, but also Comcast and others, about how they wanted to shift the responsibility for their internet service activities away from the FCC to the FTC, because the FTC has less authority to do something. And by golly, with the Trump FCC, they succeeded in that goal.
How characterize I'd say the intellectual underpinnings and environment that created the FCC?
Well, it was 19.
What's the origin story?
It was 1934, and it was all about radio, and it was all about, and radio had been regulated by the Interstate Commerce Commission in its early days, and the problem was, how do you make sure that that somebody is overseeing the fact that the airwaves, the open use of the airwaves, could mean that you have the tragedy of the commons and it's not available to anybody because it interferes with everybody else. So let's set some rules. And then that evolved into, well, let's set some rules for the monopoly service of telephone. And now we're dealing with what is typically a monopoly service of providing internet connectivity to homes and offices. And with this ruling and the whole push of the Trump administration, the Trump FCC, and the Republican Congress has been to focus on how the technology works rather than what the technology delivers. And so the sales pitch that the ISPs have been making is, oh, well, we're digital now. Those old rules, when we were monopolists, those old rules were an analog environment. And today it's digital, and we're more like Google and Facebook, and you don't regulate them, so you shouldn't regulate us, despite the fact that they continue to typically be monopolies in their communities. And so there has been a highly successful repositioning, respinning to say, well, let's not look at what they do, let's look at how they do it. And that's looking at the wrong end of the telescope.
And when we do look at what they do, what are the values we should bring to that?
You need to have so networks need to be open, equitable, and non-discriminatory. So what does that mean? I guess all of those could go under one broad rubric of openness. What we found was that 2/3 of the households in America had one network choice at most, and for high-speed broadband. And that meant that those networks sat as bottlenecks. And they could make the determinations to speed up, slow down, favor one service or another, and did. There had been two previous efforts that had been reversed by the court to try and do something about this by both Republican and Democrat FCCs. And so we said that there needed to be no blocking, no throttling, no paid prioritization, and that there needed to be transparency so that consumers knew what they were getting. And those were kind of the hallmarks that everybody pointed to. And we said that the FCC needed to have residual oversight of pricing, because what happens in monopoly situations? And unless you have somebody looking over their shoulders and with the ability to move, then there's a well-established history of how monopolies behave. And secondly, we said that there needed to be the ability to continue to observe what happens in the rapidly evolving internet world and to be able to respond to those changes. We called that the general conduct rule. Because, you asked me a minute ago, what's happened since 2013? Oh my golly, the things that we didn't anticipate in 2013. Well, the things that we don't anticipate they're going to happen 2 years, let alone 2 weeks from now, remain that kind of rapid pace of change. And so the question of a responsible oversight becomes, how do we not get bogged down in restrictive rules that would inhibit innovation, and at the same point in time, maintain the ability to make a judgment call? And so here I sit at Harvard. I went to the Ohio State University, and so I tend to see everything in football metaphors. And I called this having a referee on the field ready to throw a flag, to say, nope, wait a minute, that doesn't work. And those two powers, oversight over rates and oversight over what happens next, are as important as the bright line rules of no throttling, no blocking, no paid prioritization, and transparency.
And practically speaking, what that means for consumers is it fair to say what it means for consumers is they pay more for slower internet than many other countries?
Oh, I think the facts speak for themselves on that internet service in the United States lags behind the rest of the world.
Which arguably will have really disproportionate impact on economic development and other kinds of issues in the country.
Correct.
Why then? One thing I never understood is why Google went into Kansas City or to Austin, Texas to offer Google Fiber.
Why they did it?
Yeah, what was it like? How do we understand that? You were saying that there's the providers, the ISPs, right, and then there are the digital software platforms and, right, services that, right, sit on top of the ISPs. And here was a major digital platform going into couple of major American cities to really change the game in terms.
Well, I'm not the one to opine on why, because I didn't make the decision of why, but we can talk about the effects of them going in. And the effects of them going in, and I know this will stun everybody, that every place that Google said they were going to go in to build a competitive gigabit fiber network, the incumbent expanded their plant capacity so they could go faster and lowered their prices. Surprise! This is what happens when competition comes to town. You know, there's an interesting study that was put out, probably a year or so ago, that looks at those few markets where there actually is competition versus those broadband competition versus those markets where there isn't. And again, service is better and prices are lower. Surprise, surprise, competition works.
What about poorer communities that maybe don't have that are perceived as not having the income to pay for the higher end services? So
there are a couple of parts to that. Part one is that, fortunately, there is, in urban areas at least, there is pretty good fiber coverage. In rural areas, it is lacking. Despite the fact that we spend $4 billion a year, we the FCC spend $4 billion a year of your money to subsidize the provision of services in high-cost rural areas. There's still about 25 million homes that don't have access to fiber. But there's another part of the question, which is, so first you got to have access. And in rural areas, it's the biggest challenge, and we need to have a new approach, which we can talk about if you want there. But in urban areas, you've got fairly good coverage, but the problem is you've got a price issue. And how do low-income households get access to the most important network of the 21st century? And so what we did was we said that a Reagan-era program called Lifeline that the Reagan administration had put in to subsidize low-income access to telephone service so they could do things like make 911 calls, that needed to be expanded so that you could provide subsidies for low-income Americans to have access to broadband. I mean, 70% of school children get homework that requires some kind of online connectivity. The majority, this is a shocking statistic, the majority of students in America's public schools are below the poverty level. Those two do not mix well. How do you make sure that you can have access to the internet to do the homework in homes that may not be able to afford it? So we put in place an expansion of the Lifeline program to broadband. And unfortunately, the Trump administration, when they came in, the Trump FCC moved immediately to roll back some of the things that we put in place, all the while announcing that their principal goal was how do we solve the digital divide while they increase the digital divide.
Is there anything that, is there has the current administration sought to roll back everything you did, or are there changes or policies enacted in your tenure that they appear to be protecting?
I think the jury is still out on that. It'll be interesting, for instance, to see what they do on connecting schools and libraries. There's a lot of talk about them starting a new initiative on that. I mean, here was the thing I'm very proud of what we did on open internet and what we did on privacy. But what we did on connecting schools and libraries, when we came in, there was only about a third of the schools in America that had fiber connections, and only about half of those provided high-speed connectivity via Wi-Fi to the classroom. And when we left, that number was closer to 90% of all school campuses in America with access to the student's desk. I could tell you one quick story. So I'm out at the Edna Brewer Middle School in Oakland, looking at the impact, the before and after impact of high-speed connectivity to the classroom and to the desk. And I meet with a group of students and I say, okay, so tell me the difference between this year when you have connectivity and last year when you didn't. And they go through all of these kind of cool things that they can do and how it's helped them and this sort of thing. And I said, okay, so I'm the guy that runs the program. What would you say, what suggestions do you have? And one young girl raises her hand and she says, we need bigger desks. Because I've got my computer and I've got a desk that was designed not to have a computer on it. And it was just one of those fascinating kind of aha moments about the effects that you can have through policy decisions. But anyway.
All right, I have a couple more questions for you, and then we'll open it up to the audience. I guess my next question is about you wrote an op-ed in the New York Times last week, really looking at the growing power of the digital platforms, specifically Google and Facebook, and ways we might think about regulating them. And I just want, you earlier in this conversation talked about the internet service providers, the people really delivering direct internet access as monopolies that need to be regulated to ensure, equality, consumer fairness, and openness. What about the big digital platforms, the big service companies?
So, first of all, the ideas behind that article started here at Shorenstein and started with Wael Goyim, who was here as a fellow last fall. But there is if we go back to what I was talking about before, how we tend to look at regulatory oversight now in terms of how it is done rather than what it does, you find that the networks are acting more and more like edge provider platforms. For instance, what they do with your personal information and the kind of services that they offer, AT&T's effort to buy Time Warner, for instance. And the platforms are looking more and more like networks. I mean, if a network is something that connects two parties, then I submit to you that WhatsApp is a network, and that Facebook is a network, and that they are providing network services, but say, oh, I'm not a network. Don't regulate me like a network. And I think that we need to have a broad look at the policies that should cover, both networks and those who operate on those networks. And those policies need to get out of the trap that they're currently in, which is a manifestation of what business management and regulatory oversight looked like in an industrial world. And to say, okay, what do things look like, should they look like in a digital world? And let me give you a couple of quick examples on that relate to what we talked about. So what I was proposing in this article was that that we don't know how the algorithms of Facebook and other platforms work, and therefore we don't know the information that's coming out. So I know the decisions that the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the Boston Globe make because I can see it on the front page of the newspaper. I can read it as I turn the page. Facebook is making similar editorial decisions about what information I get, but it's hidden in a black box of an algorithm. And so my argument was that we don't need to know what that algorithm is. That's their proprietary information. But we should be able to see what its output is. And we should be able to have open APIs, application programming interfaces, how two programs work together, so that just as media watchdogs compile scorecards of what's happening in traditional media and say, well, these guys go left, these guys go right, these guys we're not too sure of, we can develop algorithms that do the same thing for the black boxes to understand what the editorial decisions being made by the black boxes in the social networks are. And similarly, we ought to be able to have public interest algorithms that look out for your and my privacy. Today, algorithms are programmed for the purpose of promoting the profits of those who own the algorithm by taking our personal information and monetizing it. I am a capital C capitalist. I am all for corporate monetization of their assets. But we need to start with the fact that it's private information that is my asset. And how can the same kind of creative thinking that built those computer software algorithms that use our information, how can you do the same thinking to protect our information? And it is technologically possible, but there are no economic incentives. And in the absence of an economic incentive, who do we turn to? We need to turn to the government to create those kinds of incentives. So we need to have a new digital look at the realities created by, and to say to ourselves, computer science got us into this situation. How is computer science going to get us out?
I mean, and it's very much the approach being taken in Europe, right? With GDPR, this is European Union legislation that really says that the individuals own their own data, and any platforms taking advantage of it in any way have to abide by many more aggressive rules than we have now. And GDPR hasn't really gone into effect yet. I believe it begins
May
phasing
25th.
in May 25th. So very curious to see how that plays out. I'm also reminded of, Doc Searles a few years ago while at Berkman, at the Berkman Center here on campus, Berkman Klein Center, proposed that he called it vendor relationship management, but this idea that instead of you having to agree to the terms and services, those long, pages and pages of legal documentation when you use an online service, that you should have your own. I, Nico, should have my terms of service, and then the corporations have to decide if they're going to respect my terms of service. That kind of algorithmic algorithms allow you to do that kind of negotiation at scale, in fact.
Correct. And so, I mean, it's just a question of incentives. I mean, you can define algorithms that will address these issues. There's just been no incentive to do it.
All right, I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience. I feel like I have dozens of questions for you, Tom, from, net neutrality and broadband and open access to the integrity of our information sphere and the way we think about news, to the role of the platforms and privacy. These are central issues to the current moment and the future, and we don't talk about them nearly enough. And here we have one of the world's experts on the subject. So, are there questions from the audience?
Yeah, Howard Cohen, second-year MPP. If we call Facebook and Google a network, does that have any impact in us being able to create obligations on their part to address the fake news problem?
Again, I think that we need to have a common set of approaches based on what you do, not how you do it. And if they're acting as networks, then the issue becomes, okay, what is the responsibility of a network?
But I think I'm going to push you a little there, because I think the platforms are challenging. Their primary source of revenue is advertising, but they also provide this this network type functionality, but that's not how they make money, right?
No. Let's see. If the job of Facebook is to join me up with my friends and people of like interest, which is a network function, and then to sell advertising that accompanies that, they are making money on a network function.
I guess what I'm really driving at is the way the FCC thinks about regulating these things.
That's a different issue.
Yeah. The way the FCC thinks about regulating these things, there are common carriers, there are broadcasters, and do platforms, do the technology companies fit into those categories?
No, the FCC does not have the tools to deal with the platform companies. Again, you go back to your question, an act written in 1934 and updated in 1996 when the internet was AOL. Does not have the authority to deal with those kinds of issues.
Okay, other questions? Oh, at the microphone, yeah?
So the ISP seemed to have got their way when the oversight power was transferred to the FTC from the SCC, as you said. So what do you think will be the next low-hanging fruit that they'd like to go after? And from your experience as FCC chairman, in what ways did you see that they tried to influence you, as they seem to have been so successful at influencing Ajapai?
Well, it's really interesting. Let me take it in reverse order. Remember, I spent a bunch of my years as a lobbyist for the network companies. Now, granted, they were small upstarts. I was in the 1970s and early 80s. I was president of the Cable Television Association, and what was happening to cable then was that the telephone companies were trying to shut them down because they didn't want the second wire into the home. So we were fighting to be competitors. In the 90s, I was the CEO of the Cellular Industry Association. And what was happening then was that the incumbent cellular companies who were tied to the big telephone companies were trying to keep from being meaningful competition there to their core business as well. So bringing that kind of an experience to the commission, I tried to look at. Well, let me do it another way. So I was before the Senate Commerce Committee for my confirmation hearing, And one of the senators said to me, well, you know, you've represented all of these industry groups. How do we know that you won't just be their shill this time around? And I said, Senator, I was an advocate for those industries. They were my client. I hope I gave them the best possible advocacy there was. But my client now is the American people. And I want to be the best possible advocate for the American people. And so I defined the job as one of what's in the common interests of the consumers rather than what's in the interest of the providers. And with a bow to Martha Minow, the fun class that I taught at the law school last semester was how do you differentiate between the public interest and the common good? Because none of these companies ever come into you and say, hey, come on, what I want to do, we all really know it's not in the public interest, you know. They come in and they say, here's how what I want to do is in the public interest. Also happens to benefit me a lot, but it's in the public interest. And my job was to sit there and listen to all these public interest pitches, and determine what is in the common good. And that's something that we don't think about in law schools, in policy schools, but it's the challenge that when you really get in those kind of positions, it's the challenge that you have to meet.
I work on a technology that's about basically applying how the internet works, but to money, and making it possible to send little packets of money to anyone. So I'm interested in what you were bringing up about platform and network incentives. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts on how might the incentives for especially the big tech platforms or the networks change if users could basically pay for services that they use with little streams of money
Yeah, if
instead
you had
of personal.
a micropayments structure. I mean, clearly that would begin to create economic incentives. The difficulty, Evan, as you know, is that the micropayments structures that have been tried heretofore haven't worked. But I'm for an all of the above attempt to find the solution. And if micropayments is the solution, let's follow micropayments.
Hi, I'm Saul Tannenbaum. I'm a resident of Cambridge. I'm a member of the city's broadband task force and also a founder of Upgrade Cambridge, which is a new group trying to bring municipal broadband to Cambridge. Thank you. I found your speech in Iowa about people banding together to bring internet, to be a remarkable one for a capital C capitalist. But
there's a simple issue here, which is if companies are failing to provide what you need, do the people have a right to band together to organize it themselves? And the answer is undoubtedly yes.
But not, the answer is yes, but that's been a subject of great legal and policy argument.
And so I tried to preempt the states that were prohibiting that kind of thing from happening. And the ISPs sued and won, as saying that the statute we were operating on didn't go that far. But excuse me, I interrupted you, sir.
It's fine. Fortunately, Massachusetts has one of the strongest laws permitting municipal utilities. We organized around all the policy issues you talked about, digital equity. There's a digital divide here. We want a free, fair, equitable internet. And those are values that resonate here in Cambridge. But what we continue to hear from people is that 5G is just going to fix this. Without really thinking about what this is and what a fix would mean. There's an incredible amount of wireless hype, I guess is the right word. How do you actually see that playing out in terms of competition and policy? And if you had any advice for a city that's thinking about this, how would you go about dealing with this emerging technology?
So it's a great question. So we were the first country in the world during my tenure to make millimeter wave spectrum available for 5G. And I think that it is important that the United States be a leader in the development of 5G. Having said that, none of us know what 5G is going to become. You know, there is one school of thought that says that it is going to be wireless fiber, that it is going to be able to solve this rural problem by delivering high-speed connectivity to homes. There's another school of thought that says, no, this is just a service to provide low latency, big bandwidth services and an expansion of the existing mobile model. And I think what we're going to see is multiple things. One is it's still years away. We're going to see trials, and that's great. But the widespread adoption of 5G is going to be some time away. Two, I think we're going to see it evolve. Remember in the days of 4G, how everybody said they had 4G, but they all performed differently? It was because the term 4G didn't have specific tech standards associated with it, and I think we're going to see the same thing now. Where, oh, I've got 5G. No, I've got 5G, but they're two separate offerings. What is certain about millimeter wave 5G, at least, is that the propagation patterns are much smaller than down in lower bands, and that means that you're going to have a density of antennas that are, you know, from some instances, 10 to 100 times as many antennas in one area as you have now. And that's going to mean that you have to have a densification of the fiber to connect those antennas, which means it's going to be a business opportunity for you.
Pedro.
Hi, I'm Pedro, I'm a mid-career student
Hello,
here. My question is, now the U.S. is moving to away from net neutrality, and as it happens, probably new business models will be created. As technology is no longer the relevant part here; it's going to be the business model. New contracts are going to be made. There'll be a whole new commercial arrangement around this new concept. Is it reversible?
Yes.
Would the government have to
Thank
pay
you for
something?
asking that. I've been sitting here saying to myself, my God, we haven't talked yet about how things can change. One, Senator Markey from Massachusetts is leading an effort to have the Congressional Review Act disapprove what the FCC has done. The chances of it, he has 50 votes in the Senate. He needs 51 votes. He needs one more Republican to do it. There's a big rally on Capitol Hill today to try and push for that. We all ought to support Senator Markey in what he is doing, because it is important to get people on the record. Who do you stand with, the people or the powerful, on this issue? Secondly, is that there are about a half a dozen lawsuits that have now been filed challenging the FCC's decision. There's one, for instance, that was filed by almost 24 state attorneys general who, in essence, say, excuse me, we're law enforcers. We understand what needs to be done, and this agency is walking away from its law enforcement responsibilities. I'm hopeful that that the court will see the wisdom of those arguments. You know, the FCC has to operate under what's called the Administrative Procedure Act. And the APA requires that all of the agency's decisions are made on facts, or fact-based, and those facts are in the record of the proceeding. And I think if you look at the record of this proceeding, It is one of a predetermined outcome without sufficient facts to justify that in the 2 years that it was in effect, so much changed that you have to reverse the previous decision. And so I'm hopeful in the outcome of the courts, but I think we have to, at every step of the way, get behind the efforts of Senator Markey and those in the Senate and those who are using the courts, because this can't be allowed to stand. And we also need to talk about it there's an election coming up, you know? And people, this is one of the reasons it's important to get folks in the Senate on the record. Where do you stand on who makes the rules for the most important network of the 21st century?
Hi, my name is Di. I'm a first-year MPP student. I have a two-part question. The first is kind of like a theme, and the second part is like a more specific example of the theme. So the first part is like, what systems and structures need to change and evolve on part of the government in order to regulate the balance between innovation and regulation? And specifically, now that we've shifted sort of like a lot of the ISP regulations, the different regulations from the FCC to FTC, which has, from my learning so far, a pretty good history of regulating different digital platforms. How do you see the FTC? What does the FTC need to change in the intermediate period in order to regulate the digital platforms?
So here's what the FTC can't do, which is the problem with this decision. The FTC cannot proactively say this is the way the market will behave. They have the authority to move against someone for an abuse or an alleged abuse. The difficulty with that is that by the time they get through the decision, the horse is out of the barn, or hell, the barn may have already burned down. And they don't have the ability to address a broad industry set of rules. The FTC is populated by good people. It is not populated by sufficient authority if those good people want to do the necessary things.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
My understanding of the FTC is that they can sort of put out suggested sort of contracts and policies for the companies to set up themselves and then come and sue them essentially when they fail to follow those policies. Is that a correct understanding?
Yeah, and that's the strategy that the FCC is following. They're saying, well, we're going to require everybody to be transparent in what they do, and the FTC can then sue them if they weren't truthful in that transparency. Here's the problem with that. I can be transparent in saying, look, I'm about to do dastardly things, and I'm a monopoly, and you have no choice but to accept these. I have totally fulfilled my transparency, and at the same point in time had the effect of delivering things that are awful for a competitive market and for consumer protection. All I have to do is say, hey, I'm going to do it. A, you don't have any choice. You're dealing with a monopoly. And B, the only remedy that exists is one that you violated the transparency, not what you did. That's the hole in the FTC approach.
My name is John Cohen. I work at the business school across the river.
Hey, John.
I do research there. And in the course of my research, I've talked to some telecoms companies executives. One of the things I've heard is that the social media companies and platforms have really hijacked the debate over net neutrality, and that we as telecoms companies are just trying to get a level playing field. And I'd be curious to get your impressions on that. You've touched on it a little bit here, and just curious to hear what you think on that. So
a level playing field depends on which end of the field you're standing And it's one of the great arguments. I mean, if I heard it once, I heard it 580 times. All I'm looking for is a level playing field. Here's the reality. The reality is that networks are special, particularly when they are typically monopoly networks. Things are not going to happen if that network isn't there. And the behavior of those networks is crucial. Go back to my starting thesis here, that we need to be looking at not how things operate, but what they do. And yes, there should be parity between networks and edge providers. I mean, the classic example is that we passed rules saying that networks needed to give consumers opt-in choice, not opt-out, opt-in choice for the use of their information. The network's response was, hey, Google and Facebook don't have to do that. My response was, I don't regulate Google and Facebook. I can't get there. But I was hoping that we put those rules in place, and the responsible response would be, hey, this is the way privacy ought to be protected, and it should apply to everybody. Instead, the networks went to Google and Facebook and said, hey, watch out, same thing's going to happen to you. Let's us band together and go to Congress and get Congress to outlaw what they did. And that's what happened. But yes, I think there's an importance in regulatory parity. And in the digital world, we're living in an environment in which the rules were made for analog, and that's something we have to deal with.
Thank you.
So, Tom, I have just really enjoyed getting to know you, and especially the breadth and variety of your career is really an inspiration to me. And I just wanted to ask you to tell us a really good story about your time in D.C. What's one of your favorite stories?
What's one of my favorite stories? You know the story of D.C., Nico, and that is that if you tell your favorite story, you'll never have lunch there again.
Oh, no, America's full of second acts, Tom.
This is a story that is relevant to the kind of things we're talking about here. When I was representing the wireless industry, I used to go up to Congress and say, there's a spectrum crunch. We need more spectrum. And the members of Congress and senators would look back at me with these glazed over eyes. What the world is he talking about? And I'd say, spectrum, the airwaves. Let me explain to you how cellular works. 10 years later, I go up as the nominee, and I'm making my rounds of the individual senators in the Senate, and in the top 3 on all their lists are, what are you going to do about spectrum? And what's significant in that is that and it's relevant to all the things we've been talking about, and that is that the representatives of the people are about as up to speed as the people they represent. And that we can't expect them all to be whiz-bang technologists thinking over the horizon and this sort of stuff. And that there is a process that everything goes through. The difficulty is, as I said before, that the buffer for that process to work out is shortening. Therefore, the challenge for all of us is to make sure that our voices are heard so that our representatives will come up to speed and act on these kinds of of issues, because we're at a point where somebody has to stand up and say, who makes the rules? And right now, particularly as a result of the Trump FCC, the Trump administration, the Republican Congress, those who control the networks and the platforms are making the rules in their own image. And I want to be real clear and say, I know most of these people. These are not bad people. But they are, nobody has repealed the law of self-interest and economic incentive. And they're dealing with that reality, in that reality, because nobody has had the guts to stand up and say, let me posit for you another reality in which the rules are made by the representatives of the people, the fiduciaries of the people. And that's what you have to operate under. That's the moment that we're at right now. It is not a one-month crusade. It is not a one-issue crusade. It is not something that will be resolved quickly, but it is the challenge of the 21st century.
Wow. On that note, thank you very much, Tom.